Hey everyone, it's Ivan, KidPatcher.com, out here to tell you about a pretty cool watch company and the genesis of this watch. Talking about Aries Watch Company and the Diver-1. So to get to the what, we'll go ahead, take a step back and start with the who. Aries Watch Company is owned, operated by Matt Graham. Matt Graham, some of you guys may recognize, not from Discovery Channel, but from Graham Combat. Been in the industry carrying guns for a very long time. Incredibly talented guy. I actually never had an opportunity to train with him when he had Graham Combat, but was always interested in the stuff he was putting out, to include his articles. Kind of a philosophy side to it. And where that really came into play was the why behind things, which honestly, I really appreciate. But he ended up doing a lot of time carrying guns for different people, working at some top levels, and he ended up departing there. And it was like, if you could do anything, what do you want to do? I'm pretty sure this question was actually posed to him by his wife. And he was like, I'd wake up tomorrow and I'd make watches. And lucky him to have a supportive wife. She was like, all right, cool. And so he's like, wow, it's real now. Let me figure this out. And he ended up starting and creating Aries Watch Company. And because of overlap from employers, circles we run in, people we know, a buddy of mine actually has a Diver-1 from Aries Watch Company. And I remember checking it out, and he kind of explained something about it, and I was like, that's pretty interesting. And so fast forward a bit of time, there was an introduction and an opportunity presented itself, and I jumped on it. The opportunity to actually go out and meet Matt and check out the whole operation, to include even building a watch. But first we started kind of where the roots were, which honestly was a 20-foot Connex box in front of his house. That's where it started. And everything was initially done in there, more or less like a little clean room. And now at this point, it's pretty much just used for sandblasting parts, things along those lines. Definitely not a clean room anymore. And inside there though, like those roots, there's also kind of this pretty cool door, which served largely, as Matt explained it, as motivation. Different quotes from different people, whether they were end users or outside support, just things that were inspirational, and yeah, pretty cool door.
And when people would visit, they would sign the door. Except Mike Tyson's never visited. So I guess I have to clarify and say that Mike Tyson hasn't visited.
Daddy has that nice handwriting.
Yeah.
After having seen the beginnings, opportunity to see where they are now. Really incredible, full-blown retail space. And yeah, just an incredible space. There's a pool table in the middle of it too. And with that attached to it is essentially their watchmaking facility. And personally learned a lot of stuff over those 2 days about watchmaking, to include the importance of light. And so ideally, which this place was set up for, south-facing windows, so you get plenty of sunlight coming in. And then the other side of it, just little nuanced things like actual, workbenches for watchmaking, which you're like, oh yeah, like a workbench. But no, one, there's all kinds of drawers for different stuff, but basically set up higher with the reason and intention of you want things pretty much on your eye level. So you'll sit down in your chair and you'll have it pretty much right in line with your eyes. And then also essentially ways that you can set it up to where your forearms are resting on it so you don't fatigue out, because some really delicate stuff going on. Really cool to check out the space. And eventually, Matt turned me over to Alina, one of the watchmakers there at Aries Watch Company. Super talented and incredibly passionate. It's really neat having someone explain something to you when they are really passionate about it, because they just go into the weeds and tell you all kinds of really cool stuff that you didn't even know was a thing. By way of example, initially starting off, We were going to be using or making this, which is a automatic. They offer a quartz, automatic, and also GMT. But with that automatic, they basically, I imagine all of them, but I don't know, they basically end up getting kind of like tuned. And so essentially put the mechanism on there or the movement on this machine, and it essentially graphs it. And it tells you at the pace it's going, essentially what the time is going to do as far as being forward a couple seconds, behind a couple seconds, over like a 24-hour period. So a lot of watch companies will take that. They'll use that machine. And the threshold is like, I don't know, like +4, -6, something like that, like pretty loose threshold. And a lot of companies will only time it in basically 2 different positions. But as you notice me just standing here, like the watch is constantly moving. That affects basically how it keeps track of time. So with that, it's actually timed in 5 different positions to a threshold of like 0.3, under 0.3, which is pretty crazy. And so the way she'll usually do it is she'll go through and take all these different readings at different positions, and then essentially keep tweaking it until the aggregate across those 5 positions is somewhere south of 0.3, which is really impressive. But after she kind of went through that, it was time to dive in and me get busy making a watch. Initially started with basically taking that movement and taking the watch face and having to put the watch face on the movement. If you're familiar with watches and that stuff means things to you, it is a ETA 2824-2 movement. Frankly, beyond my scope of knowledge. But taking that, we got into the watch face, which really interesting. I did not know watch faces are incredibly delicate. You have to be super, super careful with them. The watch faces that Aries Watch Company uses are made specifically for them by RC Tritech, I believe out of Switzerland, and they're basically painted with illumination, super luminova, I believe it is. And kind of a lot of times they will do 1 pass, maybe they'll do 2. There's actually 5 layers of illumination on this watch face for this watch, which is kind of insane considering the watch world. But when we get to later kind of the thought process and the mission, it starts to make more sense. With the watch face on the movement, it was time to jump in the deep end and put the hour hand on there. Super tiny, literally using tweezers. And again, that watch face is incredibly delicate, so you can very easily scratch it or damage it. So it's like the craziest game of operation. Basically trying to get this hour hand down perfectly, and we're basically trying to do a couple things. So the hour hand needs to be perfect, but the hour hand also in conjunction to the actual date, as far as the day of the month, needs to be perfect. So I initially put it on there, wound it through till finally goes past 24 hours and it clicks over. It wasn't totally perfect. So it didn't basically click over right precisely at 12 o'clock, which means got to very carefully pull that hour hand off and replace it. Second time, I managed to actually get it right. And then from there, keep in mind, taking breaks, because definitely like mentally taxing, if not physically taxing, but went with a minute hand. Again, super delicate, even more so than the watch hand because you're dealing with something smaller, but getting it on there, getting it lined up, just perfect. And if there was one part of this entire process where I'm like, I don't know if I can actually do this. Like, I don't know if I'm physically capable of doing this. It was actually putting the second hand on. So again, everything has just gotten smaller and smaller. Hour hand, minute hand, now the second hand. And I end up ultimately like my face an inch away with this loop, basically a little like magnified monocular with the second hand in tweezers, trying to put it on this little tiny post sticking up from the movement. It was crazy and kind of nerve-wracking. Then continuing with that suspense, kind of the moment of truth, where you actually push in the crown and see if the watch starts moving and keeping time as it should. Because on the back side of the movement, there's actually some little pieces that are super delicate and you can most certainly damage. And I feel like I'm pretty ham-fisted, especially like it was a while into like as I'm doing this that she's like, oh, by the way, like be really careful of this because of the, and I'm like, I could have used that information a while ago. But there she is thinking I probably knew something about watches. Definitely didn't. But when I pulled that thing out, started moving, super excited. So at that point, it was time to actually put this into the body of the watch, or the case, I guess. And once I got the movement into the case, put the crown in. One thing that's really cool is basically position of the crown. It is off center, away from you and your body. So as you're moving, you're not just jamming your hand into it or anything like that, which honestly I cannot stand with kind of conventional analog watches. Why they put it at 3 o'clock, beyond me. But once I had that in there, it's time to actually then head over and screw the back plate on. Back plate goes on pretty easy. There's basically a seal on there, a little O-ring, and then back to the moment of truth, the second moment of truth, which honestly I was probably more apprehensive about than anything leading up to this point, because I just spent used a number of hours and quite a bit of money with respect to just raw materials, tons of someone else's time, and this was about to go into a pressure tank. So the pressure tank, you essentially put it in there, you put distilled water in there, you seal it all up, and you crank this thing up to, they crank it up to 125 bars, which is pretty crazy. So the way depth ratings work is usually they'll do about 20% over whatever it's rated to. Matt, because he's wild, tests it with a movement in there, which some companies will not do because they're not confident in their work, but he will test it with the movements in there, because at basically 1,000 meters or 1,250 meters, which it basically ends up getting tested to, like 125 bars. If that fails, it fails catastrophically, and it's just like, I mean, that's like a submarine imploding basically. But there I was, got that thing in there, started cranking it up, and man, was so happy to look down and see it's still telling time and no water in there. Then we went out into kind of the main room, picked out some watch bands, and I set to work putting my watch band together, which on the big picture, compared with everything else I'd done, definitely the easiest part of the entire process. And then I finally had the very cool experience of putting on my watch that I had built, which was so cool. Like, literally built that watch, finally got to put it on. As it turns out though, there's a lot more to like the watch that goes out the door. So Matt got me started with the Pelican case, initially just peeling the stickers off, peeling the little plate off, and then putting the special Aries Watch Company plate on there, and then basically having to stamp that thing. I will say, definitely not one of my strong suits, apparently stamping metal with little individual stamps. But went through, initially stamping the actual watch model, Diver-1, A, automatic, and then the serial number, which as it turns out, 203 Alpha, which is pretty cool just if you're familiar with any military nomenclature. 203, right? After that, ended up kind of going through what actually goes on, or what goes into, rather, the case. One of which is a watch case itself, like a soft case, that if you don't have your watch in it, you could use it for glasses, something like that, basically microfiber lined, and then also a cloth to take care of your watch. Wipe down the face, things along those lines. Those basically nest in the bottom. And definitely grateful. I got a pretty cool pattern for my watch case and watch cloth. And then after that, there's a card, because every single watch gets pressure tested by Matt. And sometimes a lot of companies, I guess, will basically crank the pressure up, cool, hit the number, bring it back down. Matt will like turn it up and be like, all right, should be good. Then whatever, go to lunch, come back later. And it's like, oh yeah, forgot those watches are in there. Pull them out. Again, like really, really built tough. But to that end, Matt basically ends up signing all the cards because he tests all the watches, throws it in there, and then pretty cool, basically written instruction for how to use your watch, whether it's how to set the time, how to wind it, how to set the date, and kind of all the pertinent information with respect to using the Diver-1. Really cool little write-up. But not done yet. Last and final touch, basically putting the skiff sticker on there. So if you are familiar with that world, TSSCI, all of that stuff, basically you can't bring digital things like into a skiff. So you can absolutely bring a Diver-1 in there because it's analog, which is pretty handy because you get your time with everyone else when you're getting briefed and things along those lines, depending on your line of work. One thing that was really cool talking with Matt is, one, obviously his passion for what he's doing, but the underlying drive of wanting to make a watch company rather than make a watch. And what I mean by that is wanting to basically own as much of it as he can, as far as the process, being able to do things as much as he can here stateside, like all of that. Regrettably, a lot of the technology like has roots in Switzerland and stuff like that. Like, he's probably not going to make a brand new movement because people have been doing it for hundreds of years, pretty good at it. But one thing, for example, is the case for his watch. It's really cool. There's some really neat design elements in there. And like, how do you get that? Because certain things he wasn't willing to compromise on. So basically on the case, you have the lugs that come out where the watch strap goes. And because of the geometry he wanted, couldn't just machine it, because you can't machine this basically like 90-degree angle in there. So he ended up basically with these blanks, or fine blanks rather. And what they are is essentially a mold. Molten metal comes down in here, this giant, as I understand it, hammer just goes boom, smashes down, boom, there's one blank. And basically goes through making these fine blanks. And then taking that blank and then going back and machining it. And I was able to check out basically where all the machining's done now. And it's really cool. And since this is his thing, like Diver-1 is his thing, from the word go, like all his original drawings for the watch case, all these different things, there was so much thought that basically went into it too. In that, if a watch company wants to make a watch, usually they'll just buy a case, and they'll buy this case for an automatic, buy this case for a quartz, and then they'll make those watches respectively, because basically those movements have different depths, even if they're the same diameter. Matt, again, probably kind of a design, not even a design constraint, an elegant design because of probably a cost constraint. It's like, okay, well, I can't just make a bunch of different of these cases, like watch cases. So he basically designed it in a way to where that one watch case will fit an automatic movement or a quartz movement, which is pretty impressive. Basically, essentially uses like almost like a spacer ring, so it's able to offset different depths. And with this one case, it's all machined out, basically kind of step down, so it'll work across the board. And with that, there's some other interesting things. So with the Diver-1 mission timer, the bezel is actually moving 120 clicks. So every 30 seconds, there's basically an increment. And I was talking to him about just kind of the growing pains of the business. And initially had this machine shop he had like 800 fine blanks, got them in the machine shop and got the first 150 back. They were like perfect. And then eventually got the remainder back like way late, and they were not perfect. And so part of the machining process, basically at 6 o'clock and 12 o'clock, there are these two holes. And think of them as a cornerstone. Everything is measured off of those with respect to the movement, all these other things. So as it turned out, when that shop that originally, or at that point in time, was machining those fine blanks, they basically messed up with the tooling. And there was a small percentage of them which were off. Like this small percentage was off, basically those dimensions. What that translates into is the bezel not being perfectly aligned. And so how do we alleviate that? And so what they were able to figure out, like with math and engineering, is now moving forward to basically just make it foolproof, because at the end of the day, you're stacking tolerances on a certain level. You have the fine blank that gets machined, then you have like the face, the movement, the bezel, and human hands putting all this stuff together. And at a certain level, there's kind of tolerance stacking. So how do we basically address this? And the way they came to it with a ton of math is basically a series of 4 holes, roughly at 12 o'clock, and 4 holes roughly at 6 o'clock, which are, I believe, like a quarter a second apart, like math-wise. And so what they're able to do is essentially tune the bezel to the case moving forward. So if for whatever reason there's, again, these little tiny tolerances that happen to stack up, they can basically tune it to where the bezel moves perfectly as it should. Stuff like that, I think, one, is fascinating and just really cool way to approach a problem. And rather than like, oh man, like we need to like make sure we're always getting, because no, everything might not always be perfect, but the ability to actually tune something, that's pretty cool. And arguably one of the raddest things about Aries Watch Company is kind of the why behind Diver-1 and Mission Timer. So I say mission timer, you're like, I don't know what that means. Basically, think of kind of a conventional dive watch, and when you look at it, the watch face is showing elapsed time, and so is basically your bezel, showing you elapsed time. So you're like, hey, it's 10 to 3 right now, so I'm gonna move the 0 over to the minute hand, and then it's gonna show me when 10 minutes has passed, 20 minutes has passed, whatever, so that if I'm diving, I'm gonna stay down for 40 minutes. I look down, I'm like, oh, it's getting close to the 40. It's time to come up. That's cool. Not a mission timer. So a mission timer, the watch face is already telling you elapsed time. So the mission timer is basically a countdown timer. So the numbers ultimately are reversed. And so you say, hey, I'm gonna go dive for 40 minutes. You basically move to where the 40 is on the minute hand, and it's counting down until you get to that 0 mark where you're like, I need to be out of here right now. And both of them work in the same way with respect to safety. So if they get bumped and move at all, they will move in the direction that basically hedges you towards safety versus putting you out there for more time ultimately. But a couple different things. One, this actually has 120 different clicks, mission timer, basically every 30 seconds, and the idea of a mission timer. So a lot of people, it's probably foreign, you're like, I'm an accountant. That's cool. This was maybe not necessarily made for you. You can absolutely still use it, but the idea of a mission timer is you go, maybe go hit a target, you're there on target, you're like, guys, we have 15 minutes, and then we're on the bird or we're getting evac, whatever it may be, like we're done in 15 minutes. You crank that thing to 15 and it's a countdown timer. And with that, no matter what, no matter how dehydrated and exhausted, again, going back, no matter how dark, going back to those 5 layers of that super luminova, you can see that when that minute hand, which is glowing fiercely, hits that big triangle, which is also glowing fiercely, you need to be gone. Like, you glance at it, cool, like, let's get out. I don't need to see elapsed time. I can figure it out if I want to, but no, like, this is a countdown timer. A countdown to an event, whether it's, hey, we're moving on this, or hey, we need to be out of here at this, whatever it may be. So to bring it home, maybe you're a single dad and your kids are like, can I play games for 20 minutes? And you're like, sure. Put it on the 20. Occasionally glance down when that minute hand is on that big triangle. You guys are done. Not necessarily the intended role, but yeah, you can absolutely use it like that. But that's kind of some of the idea and concept behind the mission timer. Like, these were legitimately, can't speak words, legitimately made for people doing really hard work in hard conditions. And to that end, if you've never been in a place where you've been completely physically taxed, exhausted, everything like that, like, a lot of things go out the window, like good judgment, all these different things. Like, when you get pushed and flexed to that extreme, things are difficult, to include math. And so the idea being, you can see a big glowing minute hand and you can see a big glowing triangle, regardless of lighting conditions, how fatigued you are, and you're like, guys, we're leaving. Like, boom, drop dead, like, this is happening now. And that was the emphasis behind it, behind like that design and mission timer in general, which I think is honestly pretty cool, especially kind of having spent some time in that world. Again, I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to go out with Aries Watch Company and actually build this thing, like basically an heirloom piece at this point. Like, this will pretty much run forever and I'll be able to give it to my boys. Really cool timepiece. Not to mention just the backstory and all of it. Like, I think it is a really cool story. And the fact it's actually a mission timer. Again, really cool. But as I end up spending more time with this watch, I'll actually give you guys a full review on this watch that I built. If it breaks, really, it's on me. But considering it's pressure tested to over 1,000 meters, it'll probably take a beating. But I'll end up bringing you guys a full review. If you're interested in Aries Watch Company, there'll be links down below. You can go check it out. Again, really cool company. And if you're in the Pacific Northwest, north of Seattle, you can actually check out their showroom, which, again, super cool. Maybe go play a game of pool. I don't know. But overall, really rad experience. And lastly, if you appreciate my content and want to support it, I greatly appreciate it. Whether it's liking and sharing videos or supporting me directly through Patreon, helps me go out there, create more content for you. And through Patreon, usually have basically early access to videos, as well as some exclusive stuff from time to time. And lastly, happy to answer questions over there, either on our Discord or DMs. But as always, thanks for joining us at kitbadger.com. Look forward to seeing you next time.